Hi, I'm Mike Reynolds, a senior reporter covering the media industry with S&P Global Market Intelligence, Tech, Media, and Telecom News Team. Welcome to MediaTalk, a podcast hosted by S&P Global, where the news and research staff explore issues in the ever-evolving media landscape. Today, I'm joined by Stefan Modrich, my colleague on the TMT News Team. Stefan covers tech policy and is the author of Washington Watch, which you can find on Cap IQ Pro. Stefan is going to weigh in on some of the things he's been watching in our nation's capital. How you doing today, Stefan?
Doing well, Mike. Good to be with you.
All right. Before we take a closer look at some of the DC doings, I just wanted to say that Stefan has been training to run a marathon in Germany, and that will be a prelude to him running in New York at some point. Can you give us a sense about how it's been going? Are you ready?
Yeah, Mike, thanks for asking. It's been definitely a fun summer and fall. A lot of training that went into this. Now we're in the home stretch and excited to finish it off.
All right. Last year at this point, we're heading into the presidential election cycle, and there was a lot of concerns about AI and how campaigns and election administration officials were taking steps to bolster cybersecurity efforts amid threats to global elections from, say, quote unquote, hostile foreign actors. As it turned out, there were discussions about disclosure requirements around the use of content generated by AI for political ads on broadcast, TV, and radio. Such a rule didn't actually pertain to the 24 election cycle, and I'm not sure that's the case this time around for the gubernatorial or local races. But will there be something in place that way, Stefan, as we get to the midterms in 26?
Yeah, there will indeed, Mike. As it stands now, there are 25 states with various different laws, all requiring disclosures of this AI-generated content. And some of that actually did take place during the 2024 election.
Okay.
But in terms of the way in which it was enforced and whether or not there were actual criminal penalties, there was the one case in the New Hampshire primary that was a big deal. There was someone who was actually charged with trying to impersonate former President Biden through an AI-generated robocall. So that is a precedent to look for. But in terms of different ways states are approaching this, you have Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Texas. These are all states which have laws where actually there is a civil or criminal penalty for knowingly using AI to misrepresent a candidate or otherwise try to influence an election. But the language can vary here, but it all essentially means the same thing, whether they're calling it deceptive, synthetic, or deepfake, which is a term that you and I have seen pop up quite often here, ranging from as far as Hawaii to Rhode Island. There's a dozen different states where there are actually time limits in these election cycles. We'll start to see this kick in. California, as it stands now, has the longest. So essentially what that means is 120 days before an election and up to 60 days after, there is a moratorium on using any AI-generated content in campaign material.
Okay. Sticking with the AI watch, Stefan, you recently wrote a piece about the Trump administration's AI action plan versus the states and smaller tech companies. Seemingly, there's a limitless number of bills and actions going on. I don't remember per se, but more than 1,300, almost 1,400 bills have been introduced at the state level across all 50 states, as well as Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, and D.C. into July there. Many expand existing protections against the possession of child sexual abuse material to include computer-generated imagery, including images made by AI. Others cover specific industries' use of AI, including healthcare, insurance, real estate, or the government itself. I think the NCSL said 38 states had adopted or enacted about 100 measures during the most recent legislative year. You and I, we've used this phrase before, patchwork. Is this patchwork squared or patchwork to the nth degree here? What's going on?
Yeah, so that right there, Mike, that is the essence of this challenge that I've been hearing about in reporting on this from many different lawyers and industry groups and the companies that are involved in the space. Because whenever we talk about AI and it being such a nebulous, daunting, and ubiquitous thing that's involved and embedded in so many different aspects of our commercial lives, what you'll see in the absence of a federal statute is a more targeted effort to go after specific sectors and industries where AI kind of has an intersection or is embedded in with existing product or service. So you mentioned healthcare. That's a good example because thinking about like a telehealth or like a mental health services aspect where you have an AI chatbot. And if there was a chatbot that were to provide advice that was negligent or even harmful, like where does the liability lie? And that is one of the questions that these kind of regulatory frameworks are designed to answer or should be designed to answer according to experts that we've spoken with in our reporting. So whether it's the developer or the company that the developer hired to make these LLMs. So, and there's going to be more on this. So Cap IQ Pro subscribers should look out for that. There's going to be a piece that I'm working on now that it dives deeper into Colorado's AI law. And so that one was a law that was pretty controversial in that it went as far as anyone has tried to in the US so far to get to a more EU style privacy law and AI privacy law. And then Utah has an interesting thing going on with their regulatory lab where they allow companies to opt in to certain regulations and then be exempt from certain things in order to encourage their participation and try to kind of collect more data and have a better understanding of how AI works and how it should be regulated.
Yeah, this patchwork, complex, whatever word you want to use, this is going to keep you busy for quite some time, right?
No doubt.
Okay. We talked about this last year. If I remember, bills were passed in both chambers of Congress, but yet the kids' online safety legislation is being looked again by the Senate. Are we moving toward anything here, Stefan? Is this going to be enacted? And is this going to be pushed up to President Trump at any point soon?
Yeah, there's been a lot that has happened since we last talked about this. But one interesting thing that I think in these policy circles that has emerged as part of the discussion that was different from before is it was always so COSA and then COPPA/COPPA 2.0 were always mentioned in the same sentence. And
Okay.
now there's a lot more buzz about the UK's equivalent legislation, the UK Online Safety Act. And there's a gap both in cultural and legal approaches toward the criminalization of speech between the US and UK. You might even say it is as wide as the Atlantic now. And that is something that there was actually the former UK MP, Nigel Farage, was testifying in front of Congress earlier this month in front of the House Judiciary Committee. He was warning about COSA and COPPA 2.0 representing potential threats to free speech innovation. So there is this debate going on right now, both between Democrats and Republicans on the Hill and also House and Senate Republicans, because they still disagree, even though that the House Speaker Mike Johnson has reintroduced on the agenda. It's still unclear just how much that might be changed. Again, we saw how many different versions of it were altered through that committee process. So at this point, it is still very early on in that, and I would not expect to see something heading to the president's desk anytime soon.
Okay, fair enough. I think there was a recent Senate panel where whistleblowers came forward alleging that Meta had covered up research that its virtual reality devices and apps deleted or modified safety research showing that children using the devices were exposed to 3D content that in some instances may have had elements of grooming, sexual assault, and violence. That sounds very nefarious.
Yeah, at this hearing, you had two former Meta researchers who came forward as whistleblowers. They were very critical of Meta's approach. They alleged that the company's lawyers had dictated what they could and could not research in this virtual reality space. Those who are gamers or familiar with this technology, essentially this is the Oculus, like the Meta headset, essentially provides you access into this metaverse virtual reality space. And that is what we're talking about here, where the testimony suggests that Meta suppressed and prevented the collection of data of instances where minors were, whether they were playing games or otherwise accessing the content on that platform, that they were potentially subject to abuse, harassment, or sexual exploitation, and that Meta's legal team was actively trying to suppress the collection of that. And ranking member of the committee, Amy Klobuchar, she mentioned that this is an example of why she supports repealing the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, because of the liability shield that it gives platforms like Meta in situations like this.
All right. Let's turn now to Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, BEAD. It's my favorite acronym of all time. BEAD aims to provide, I think, over $42 billion of funding to achieve high-speed broadband access throughout the U.S. The monies will be allocated under Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Things were moving along. Then the Trump administration revamped some of the criteria, I believe. Stefan, can you take us where things stand with BEAD at the moment?
Sure. The cost savings that have resulted from the Trump administration's review or reallocation of this fund, they had reported a cost savings of about $13 billion. And so when this was announced, there emerged this suggestion, and the Louisiana governor, Jeff Landry, was one of the voices in this conversation, who wrote a letter to the Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, suggesting that the state should keep the excess funds and spend them on state-led AI-related programs. So it could result in some additional kind of political infighting as the NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, decides how to disperse those funds. But there have been critics of this administration who have been saying that the reconciliation bill, the way that it was written, it forces states to choose between this AI regulation and BEAD funding. And so it was viewed as a backdoor to, even though the AI moratorium, which was a hot topic during the sort of process of whittling down this one big beautiful bill, there is still provision in there that does have this choice between AI regulation and BEAD funding. So some states may find that they have to do that if they want to keep the funding, and that is something that we'll have to keep an eye on in terms of whether other states want to lobby aggressively to get some share of that 13 billion or otherwise.
All right. Stefan, what's your take about the U.S. government taking a 10% stake in Intel? U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts, she's the ranking member of the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, is not too happy with it.
She is not. And the consensus among experts I spoke with was that this is a high risk deal with little upside for either party, save for the short term shot in the arm that it's giving to Intel. So, one of the experts I spoke with for this story, her name's Ann Skeet. She's the senior director of leadership ethics at the Markula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. She said that it's troubling from an ethical perspective about the mechanics of essentially undoing the subsidy agreement that was reached with Intel via the CHIPS Act. So this is a bipartisan law that was passed, signed into law by President Biden at the time. And so it raises questions about the possibility of more funding like this being repurposed and larger questions about undermining congressional authority. That this is a law that was written to be performed and executed in a specific way. And so when we're already seeing Congress not kind of exercise its classical constitutional authority with respect to trade or other matters, it does raise interesting questions about there are a lot of other companies that have received CHIPS Act funding, and will they perhaps return the funds if they're concerned about an ethical dilemma of having to have new conditions attached, new strings attached to that money?
Interesting. Interesting. I know there's another subject you at least wanted to touch on in this installment of Media Talk, Stefan. The revenue agreement from NVIDIA and AMD to pay the U.S. government 15% of their revenue in exchange for what? Can you explain here?
Yeah, so this is of a piece with sort of the Trump administration's broader strategy, and it ties in pretty closely to what went on with the Intel deal. And it's all of a piece with the unprecedented way in which the Trump administration is engaging with and asserting leverage over crucial U.S. supply chains and industries. So, with respect to this AMD and NVIDIA deal in particular, it's become more complicated because, as our friends at Panjiva know, and anyone who is involved in the process of buying and selling goods anywhere, it's a two-way street, right? You require the permission not only to export, but also to import the goods.
Right.
And so it requires the Chinese approval on their end to accept the NVIDIA H20 chips and the AMD MI308 chips that the Commerce Department recently did offer their approval of to regain access to the Chinese market. But again, it's one thing to have approval to export, but if the gateway to imports is closed, it means that there won't be any revenue on Chinese chip sales for the U.S. to take that 15% cutoff.
Yeah. Our plan is to release another Media Talk tech and regulatory episode before year end, when we will dive into the Intel and NVIDIA AMD deals more deeply. We've talked a lot about tech here, obviously. We're going to finish up on old school tech, if you will, broadcast TV. Well, there's a deal out there where Gray and EW Scripps want to swap stations that have approved to fortify their bases in Michigan in the Southeast and out west in Colorado and Idaho, respectively. There's a much bigger deal. Nexstar, which already owns the most broadcast stations in the U.S., wants to acquire Tegna for some $6.2 billion. Stefan, you cover this deal. What are we looking at in terms of market synergies and enhanced business opportunities there?
Yeah, I wrote at the time that the indications were that this merger would be a test of the FCC's deregulatory agenda. And as we'll get to in a moment, I think there is evidence that the FCC looks to be setting the table for that by creating the regulatory conditions that would allow this Nexstar Tegna deal to clear. As for the question of whether the local broadcasters kind of really are this last line of defense at the head of this wave of AI slop that we're seeing a lot on social media, I think I'm probably less likely to put all my eggs in that basket in terms of this being the solution. But thinking about some of the bigger M&A we've seen in this space, I do think it's interesting because another large acquisition that Paramount made recently to acquire the publication, The Free Press, from the former New York Times op-ed editor, Barry Weiss. They started a publication called The Free Press for $200 million. And this was one of the largest startup media deals since the New York Times acquired The Athletic for $550 million in 2022. So I'm curious, what do you think about this, Mike? But also, it's interesting, as we are in the media business ourselves, integrating another newsroom into a legacy newsroom like that, how that will all play out, what the implications of that are. And I do think that is interesting when we're talking about where does this whole media puzzle of local news, broadcast, online, how this world is evolving. I think it's an interesting step that CBS is taking there.
Yeah, I think I agree with you in the sense that these are shifting sands, which are moving quite rapidly. And does political and general public sway the moves to what's going to be allowed? Again, we will see. It's early stages in that. there will be more deals done. And again, I think just the voices are just everywhere, and you can read into what you think a deal may do and then what might actually occur behind the scenes. We're all kind of spectators in that regard. So plenty more on that going ahead. I think there's a FCC hearing this month about station regulation, but maybe it's more about duopolies than the 39% national cap for stations. Stefan, any news from the card camp about this?
There is, in fact, and so I'm definitely eager to see what will be said about this at that meeting later this month. So the FCC did add an item to its agenda titled the Modernizing Broadcast Ownership Rules. As you know, this directly addresses that local television rule, which limits a single entity from owning more than 2 television stations in the same local market. And there's a call for public comment to ask the question whether or not that does remain necessary or is still in the public interest as a result of competition in the space. And there's a similar item in that same notice of proposed rulemaking with respect to local radio ownership. But what I thought was even more interesting was a request for comments on the dual network rule, which prohibits a merger between the big four of ABC, CBS, Fox, and NBC. And I thought, as this is definitely more your bag than mine, Mike, but just in a world where I'm more of an observer, where I'm having to get used to the prospect of seeing both Charles Barkley and Stephen A. Smith sharing the same screen time at ESPN, I think to me, this seems like the Wild West.
Yeah, I have to agree. It's a far cry from CBS and then Turner Sports teaming on the NCAA basketball tournament. There's more collaboration, how it works, how it can be governed. And to your mention of Stephen A. Smith, he hasn't ruled out the possibility of running for president. We'll see how that brings us. Anyway, that concludes this episode of Media Talk. I want to thank Stefan for spending so much time sharing his insights on current events in DC. Stefan, thank you very much, and the best with your marathon in Berlin.
Thanks, Mike. I'll have a beer and a pretzel for you.
I appreciate that. I also want to thank all of you for listening. This is Mike Reynolds. We'll catch up on the next edition of Media Talk.